You're probably familiar with Kobe Bryant. Over his 20-year career, he won 5 NBA titles, 2 Olympic gold medals, was selected for the All-Star game 18 consecutive times, and is 4th in total points scored all time. He also played 48,637 total minutes in the NBA, and by my calculations, he practiced for over 20,000 hours, not including any of the time he was playing on the basketball court. I would also speculate that that's a gross underestimation of how many hours he practiced over his career. How did a boy who grew up in Italy, who didn't necessarily fit in middle school and high school in Philadelphia, who loved writing and poetry and sort of geeky things like Star Wars and the book Ender's Game, end up as one of the greatest high school and professional basketball players of all time? So Kobe is really known for his hard work, his determination, as well as his competitiveness. And a lot of podcasts, a lot of people talk about those things. There are so many stories about how early he would show up to practice and how dedicated he was. But from what I've seen, there's very little that dives into why he worked so hard, what fueled his competitive fire, and what drove his determination. And that's the focus of the Exponential Athlete podcast. I'm consuming all of this information and digesting it to try to get to what the building blocks are of Kobe Bryant or any great athlete's, incredible success. So this is part 1 of the 3-part Anatomy of an Athlete series on Kobe Bryant. The first part here, we're going to focus on learning. So how Kobe learned, what his philosophy on learning is. Part 2 is focusing on his mentality and his mindset. Obviously, there's been a lot said about the Mamba mentality, and we're going to dive really deeply into what that is, where that comes from, and maybe how we can create that for ourselves. And in part 3, we're going to focus on outside factors that contributed to his success. So how he was raised in Italy, his dad being a former NBA player. And we're also going to touch on some of the pitfalls of his success. So he works really hard, all these things, he put in all this effort, but because of that, his body broke down earlier. Because of having to really dedicate to something, he might have had to isolate other people or cut off some things. And we're going to see if maybe we can learn to avoid some of those things throughout our own careers. I also think it's important to ask the question, why did I want to start with Kobe? Why did I choose him as the first person? There's probably better athletes all time than he is. To me, Kobe is a really good example of what this podcast is about. So yes, he was 6'6". He was a great NBA player physically, but his hands weren't that big. There were still things that he needed to work on. And he understood that there were these small details in his physicality, in the nature of his game and his footwork, that if he did all those things really well, it would give him a massive advantage against his peers. And so all these little things, all these details added up to create this compounding advantage over time. And again, that's the idea behind this Exponential Athlete podcast is, in our own lives, can we take these little things, these little advantages that we create, that only we can create, and add them up so we have this massive advantage compared to everyone else in the long run. I would also say Kobe is fairly unique because he wrote this book, Mamba Mentality, where he really dives into his own philosophy on a lot of these things. It's not just for having to get secondhand accounts. He was very transparent and probably more self-aware than most other athletes I've seen in the sense that he knew what made him great. Whereas a lot of other athletes, including ones I work with, they're just doing what comes to them naturally, and they don't really articulate what makes them great or what makes them different really well. So Kobe was really good at that. Still, I read 4 or 5 books on Kobe, and there are things that he doesn't pick up on that other people pick up on. So it's important to get this 360-degree view of Kobe Bryant to understand really what does make him great. I also want to say what this isn't. So this podcast isn't just about worshiping Kobe Bryant. We also want to talk about his pitfalls. And it's not a biography of Kobe Bryant by any stretch of the imagination. I'm choosing examples that fit into a framework rather than telling you the story of Kobe Bryant from when he was a kid growing up to his eventual death in the helicopter accident. So I want to be clear that if you want that story, there's great books around his life. One is called Showboat, which was a very good biography that told a really good tale till he retired to the NBA. There's also a lot of really excellent podcasts out there that you can listen to learn about what he was like after he retired from his career. So a little bit, you might as well jump into the learning section of this podcast. I wanted to focus on learning because I believe that that is a core building block of success. Figuring out how to learn effectively first allows us to compound everything going forward. So if we learn quicker and we integrate those things quicker into whatever we're working on, we get these compounding returns over time, and we can make these iteration loops quicker and quicker over time. Again, this really resonates with the idea of the overarching podcast, that if we do some things really well, really quickly, that pays dividends in the long run. And, Kobe himself was a student of everything. This is something I really liked about him. I think if he were listening to this podcast, this is what he would want to start with as well. I really want to kick this off by reading a quote from John Cox, who is Kobe Bryant's cousin. I think that this is a good segue into Kobe's learning philosophy and a little bit about how he viewed the world. He read. He was a big reader, read everything. It was more focused on people who were masters of their craft, to see what they did and how they were getting ahead, picking up little things. He was still doing it for basketball, but that wasn't all. He was reading to help himself become more articulate and educated. So as you can see, this is a pretty loaded statement about Kobe Bryant. He was reading to get ahead. He was reading to understand basketball, but he was also reading just to expand his overall knowledge. And again, I don't want to keep harping on that. This is kind of the idea of the podcast here, but I'm trying to study these people, the greatest athletes, to figure out what I can pull out of their lives and integrate into my lives, or share with you all to integrate into your lives. So what if I go through, the best 100 athletes of all time and pull out something unique from each of them? Hopefully we get a guide map to what could make us great, whether it's in athletics or in our profession, or just make us successful overall. So the first section that I have here is called Curiosity Fed the Mamba. I have little section heads for each aspect of learning that Kobe Bryant focuses on. So curiosity was something that was in Kobe from a very early age. And I think curiosity is the bedrock for learning in general. You have to be curious about basketball. You have to be curious about how things fit together, whether it's unrelated to basketball. How do we take schoolwork and make it related to basketball? And Kobe was full of it. So even at a young age, here's a good example. So Joe Bryant, Kobe's dad, was subscribing to a service that delivered video of games directly. Joe and Kobe would pore over them together, taking note of all the subtleties, the footwork, the drop steps, the jab steps, the V-cuts, the various offensive and defensive styles of NBA teams and their stars. I used to watch everything from Magic to Bird to Michael to Dominique Wilkins, Bryant recalled. I used to watch their moves and add them to my game. So even as a kid, he's absorbing these things, he's emulating them. He's curious about how all these different people play basketball. It isn't just one or two people. Yes, he focused particularly on Magic Johnson when he was a kid. And I forget one other player who's a little bit obscure. Kobe wasn't just focused on learning basketball, though, as I mentioned before. He was even really involved and studied very hard in his schoolwork. So what a lot of people don't know is Kobe did relatively well in the SATs. He was a good student throughout all high school, and it's because he was curious for knowledge. So even though Bryant's focus on his schoolwork didn't approach the mental effort he directed towards basketball, Mastriano, who was his favorite English teacher in school, also sensed his sizable hunger for gaining all sorts of knowledge. He sees learning as empowering. He listens very intently. She offered in 2014, "Could you imagine what the world would look like if everybody lived that way?" So it's not just, I think that the phrase empowering is really important there. Kobe realized at a very young age that if he learned something, it could apply to basketball, it could apply across all other aspects of his life. So he viewed all information as very precious. It's not just, this public speaking course, I don't want to take it because I'm in high school. But if your goal is to, or because you're not interested now, if your goal is to be a professional athlete, you're going to have to be in the media. You're going to have to do all these things. So it actually benefits you to learn that now because you can practice it and it can help with a lot of endorsement deals, whatever it is in the long run. So you're able to apply a lot of these things together. And I think that, Kobe realizing that at a young age is a very powerful thing. A couple things he really liked, and I'm going to get really deep into this later in the podcast, is studying the greats before him. We're going to see a lot of examples of how that really was an inspiration and also a major factor contributing to the growth of his game. There's even little things like when he was in the NBA, he was still taking college courses. Or when he was in high school, he wasn't just curious about academics. He wasn't just curious about basketball. He was curious about other people and their experiences. I mean, him coming from Italy, he had to integrate into Philadelphia, which, he went to a sort of upper middle class school, but he was playing basketball against people who were, from rougher neighborhoods who had very different experiences. And he wanted to understand what that was like, whether it helps him in basketball, whether it helps him in life or assimilation when he's playing on AAU teams. It's important for him to gather that knowledge. And there's a couple more examples later in his life, which I think are really practical for understanding this curiosity as well. So the first is that, just with his wife, she comes from a Latin family, and he obviously spoke Italian growing up, but he learned Spanish to communicate better with her and her family. He also learned to play the piano, the Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven by ear, as a surprise gift to his wife. So he was able to integrate learning and the curiosity of this, and a little bit of a challenge because he refused to get a teacher for this. But he was able to integrate that even to his personal life. He was that curious of a person. And if you have that curiosity through your whole life, the amount of information that you take in, the amount of information you're exposed to and open to, inevitably there's going to be some overlap where it helps you on the basketball court. It helps you in some other area of your life. And making those connections is very important. The last thing with curiosity, which I think was very telling, is that after he finished with his basketball career, when he was going into the production industry, I watched a podcast talking about how he hires for those roles. The number one thing that he hired for was curiosity. So he wanted people who were willing to push the boundaries, willing to propose things or think of things that they might have thought would be very difficult or impossible. And then the second characteristic that he looked for was their determination. So he looked for people who would push the boundaries and try to do things that were very difficult, and he wanted them to have the determination to see those things through. I think for me, after reading so much about Kobe and his curiosity, that got me thinking about how can I be more curious in my own life? How can I be curious approaching problems or having an open mind about a lot of things? I recently read a book called A More Beautiful Question, and that's all about asking the right questions. And I think questions are sort of the key to opening up that curiosity. So they have a really great framework that I wanted to share called the Why, What, If, How framework. So you can use this line of questioning to essentially parse out more details around any question that you might have or around any domain you might have. So let's take this podcast, for example. So, I'm thinking about making a podcast. I first have to say, why do I want to make a podcast? Well, personally, I think that the domain of sports is really interesting. I have a foot in it already. I really enjoy doing this research. I'd be reading these books anyways, right? So what if I wanted to grow it? So you can start posing these questions of, why is the core reason something exists or why you're doing something? What if is speculation about probing what types of options are possible? And then how is how you get the implementation done. So what if would be, what if I wanted to grow this? What if I wanted to get this going? So what would I need? I need a microphone. I'd need, basically just a Spotify account or whatever it is where I would post the podcast. And then how would I actually get that done? So I'd set aside time to record. I do all these things. And the questions that I have applied there start to create a framework for how I would go about pursuing this knowledge or taking action on something that I'm interested in. So, that book is really good. I'll link it in the show notes, but that framework is something I use in everything, whether I'm asking questions about myself for more introspection, or I'm asking to understand a domain or a topic to get to some actionable solution. So the next section is called More Than Basketball, but Still Basketball. So I alluded to earlier that Kobe is, very curious, but he also can make these connections of almost everything he does back to basketball. He has a really incredible gift of doing this. So something that surprised me also was that he had a lot of interests outside of basketball. Obviously, he's best known for his, single-mindedness and practice and all these other things, but there were plenty of other sports, plenty of other passions that he had, but in some way he was able to relate those all back to basketball. So even when he was a kid, he really enjoyed playing soccer. He even went out for the varsity soccer team at his high school before the coaches told him that he shouldn't do that and he should just play basketball. But he credits a lot of playing soccer as a kid in Italy to improving his basketball footwork. That's something that he learned, and it was a lesson he could fold into basketball. Kobe was also very into writing poetry and also into rap music. So he even had a record deal when he first entered the NBA. He was that good at music, and he was that serious about it. It didn't end up working out because basketball really took over, and he had sort of a not a great showing at the. I think he performed at one of the All-Star games, and that was probably more of a signal that he shouldn't do that and he should play more basketball. But he was a serious artist. And I think this is a really good quote that shows how rap was related to basketball in his life. In many ways, Bryant was merely learning to articulate his athletic intentions in a way that his new contemporaries like Donnie Carr could understand. The rap game quickly allowed him to gain a means of relating. Even better, it would become the foundation of his style of trash talk on the floor, essential for playing confidence games with the opponent. So, he doesn't probably realize it at the time, but freestyling rap made him closer with his peers. A lot of the peers that he was playing AU ball with, a lot of peers who were maybe coming from not as affluent or not as well off a background than he was, which likely helped him integrate with teams better. Obviously, there were still some issues with him, people saying that he was overconfident or cocky or hogging the ball. But without this, without a means of connecting, it could have definitely been even worse. But it also led to, the evolution of how he trash talks on the basketball court. So it's not just, he likes rap music. It's this type of stuff. It's like, no, rap music becomes part of his basketball game. Something that I really enjoyed is that it wasn't just these things. Even schoolwork was training for him or was leveraged into basketball. The only way I was able to pick up details on the court, to be aware of the minutia on the hardwood, was by training my mind to do that off the court and focusing on every detail in my life. By reading, by paying attention in class and in practice, by working, I strengthened my focus. That is, something that really stood out to me, that Kobe is always on. He is always learning. It's always related to basketball. He's focusing on schoolwork, and that focus carries over to basketball. I don't think a lot of people realize this, but the ability to focus, the ability to buckle down, the ability to have discipline, that's an acquired skill, and you could practice it in everything you do. I think that there's an old adage that you do anything like you do everything, and that really applies to Kobe. If he's, taking a test with the same intensity that he plays basketball and he's working on that skill, and other people are only exercising that intensity on the basketball court, how much more energy or how much more will is he going to have over the long term? The best example, and one of my favorite examples of sort of this cross-training methodology, did come later in his career. So, and it came with one of his ankle injuries. So here's an example of that. But the ankle was so bad that, to be honest, I couldn't hoop much that summer. What I did do, though, was take up tap dancing. That's right, tap dancing. That was the worst sprain, but it certainly wasn't my first. I realized at that point I needed to be proactive about strengthening my ankles. After researching the matter, it became apparent that tap dancing was going to be the best way to build my ankle strength while simultaneously improving my footwork, my foot speed and rhythm. I worked on it that summer, and it benefited me for the rest of my career. How many NBA players are going to pick up tap dancing because they think it could help them in basketball? The fact that he could make this connection, the fact that he was willing to do the research, that really shows you the kind of mind that he has. And that's also something that I think we can all exercise, right? We can start to say, how would this help me in this other thing? One of the reasons I like podcasting is it helps me work on my conversation and interpersonal skills. It probably helps me in my communication with my girlfriend. That probably helps me in my interfaces with any coaches that I have, with any things that I'm working on. The skills that you build, there's a foundation of them. And the training that you have, there's a foundation of them. And there's a lot of crossover. There's a couple other sort of miscellaneous examples that I think really emphasize this point. And I want to sort of go down this list because it's very impressive to me. And, these might start to spark some ideas about how you can what I would consider cross-train your mind or cross-train your body for whatever sport or whatever pursuit you're taking on. So Kobe, the first thing, you probably heard this before, he brushed his teeth left-handed. You hear about a lot of NFL receivers doing this. It helps you work on your on being more ambidextrous. I mentioned before, but he learned Spanish talking with his wife. This ended up helping him in his basketball career as well. So he would talk with Pau Gasol, who was instrumental in his second 2 NBA championships. They created a really good bond because they could both speak Spanish. He also talked a lot of shit to Pau Gasol during the Olympics when they were playing Spain, and that was sort of a code language that they have, or a different way of needling. Also, imagine being on the court playing basketball against someone and you don't understand what they're saying. That would likely be a mind game that he would play with a lot of people. If you watch this documentary called Kobe Doing Work, it goes through one game and Kobe's mic'd up the whole time, and you hear him speaking Spanish to Pau and you hear him speaking Italian to another player on his team. Imagine how disorienting that would be for the opposing team. I mean, that's like little things like that add up to wins. Another really interesting one is that showcases how interested Kobe was in connecting everything to basketball. So when he was a kid, he was the ball boy, and he was cleaned the courts for the Italian league that his dad played in. And since he was doing it at one of the big tournaments, they were essentially offered to pay him to wear some branding for them. And he said all he wanted was a bike. And so he does it, he gets the bike, and the only reason he wanted that bike is so he could go practice basketball at a park that was a little bit further away. And then probably my favorite example of this was when Kobe started playing Allen Iverson for the first time. Obviously, they were sort of rivals that came in the league at a very similar time. And Kobe was studying how sharks essentially eat seals or hunt seals for hours. And he's trying to see if he can take anything from that about how to, if he can take that and it can help him guard Allen Iverson. And he, in the playoffs, he did end up, having a really good defensive game against Allen Iverson later on. So he was looking to see how they hunted, how they approached things, how they could, I guess, like square up on the seals. And to me, that's, who would think that? Like what things are out there that are corollaries to what you're doing that might be unbelievably foreign? That is a gift, and hopefully something that we can work on as well. Even in my own life, I'm not going to compare myself to Kobe Bryant, but I start to see these things in some of the sports that I play. I've been training jiu-jitsu for around 2 years. Before that, I played golf my whole life competitively. And something with golf is you watch a lot of swing video, right? You see yourself on camera a lot. You start to match up what it looks like with what you feel. And I didn't realize that, but that was a skill that I took to jiu-jitsu. I could see someone do something and I could replicate it a lot better than a lot of my peers because I had such good body awareness from the training of me watching video and trying to replicate that movement. It's very little things where you see the crossover that you might not, and having your mind open to those things is a very powerful thing. There's another example with, for example, samurais, right? In feudal Japan, there was a massive correlation between swordsmanship and pensmanship. People thought that those two things were directly related. The precision that you need, the control of your breathing and of your the fluidity of your stroke. A lot of people in that day and age would practice pensmanship to get better at swordsmanship. I don't know if that connection might be tenuous at best, but to me, it's interesting that this is something that has been tested over time. And so, after this section, my thought would be, how do you connect different things in your life? Maybe if you're not that good a student, but you realize academics or learning to focus in school could help you in whatever sport you play, that's a reason to learn to focus there. It might be difficult, but understanding and getting over the difficulty there could be a really powerful thing. I know that a lot of the times, if I don't want to do something, if it feels difficult, I will just push it aside. But on the other hand, if I'm working on building that muscle of overcoming what I believe to be adversity, that's actually a strength in anything that I do. So it's more of a reason to do that. The next section is called reps and experimentation. So Kobe was unbelievable, probably one of the best at getting extra practice in. He practiced more than probably almost anyone ever in the NBA. And it wasn't just that he was getting a lot more time on the court, getting more shots up. It was that he was also iterating and improving over that period of time. So, just to highlight how much he was playing and practicing, this is what his schedule in high school like. Who was Kobe Bryant during the spring and summer of 1994? He was a kid who had no free time because he wanted no free time. A kid who played in at least 6 basketball leagues and at least 2 basketball camps and traveled the East Coast for AAU tournaments, and who carted his school books with him on those trips so he could complete his homework, and whose typical July day began with a game at 9 a.m. and ended with a game at 9:30 p.m. He was a kid obsessed. That's a lot of basketball. I mean, growing up, I thought I played a lot of sports. I was in 2-3 leagues. He was doubling up what I was doing by a long shot. Each league, each trip, each camp, each game refined a particular aspect of his evolution, both individually and collectively at Lower Merion. By playing so much, by playing with and against such varied opponents and teammates, he took himself from being an excellent high school player as a sophomore to being a great high school player as a junior. So this to me really highlights the evolution of his game. He has varied skill, has opponents of varied skill, and he's able to work things at different levels. So at the lower skill competition, he can try out new moves and he can refine them and perfect them as he goes up in competition. He has the ability to work that around. And to me, that is something that we all need to think about. You usually want to have a normal distribution of how you improve. So you want, maybe 33% of the people you practice with to be lower skill. So you can work on things, experiment in more low stakes things. Around 33% to be of equal skill to you. So you're able to execute when it matters. And then you want around, that other 33% to be more skilled than you so that you can see the biggest flaws in your game and in the new movement patterns. To me, he was able to build that in from a really early age. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the 3rd episode about these outside factors. But I think that is a major contributor to his success. A good example of this is here. But Kobe would be working out at the JCC or in his driveway. So he was constantly working. You would see these glimpses of him. Oh, he's different now. Narberth Summer League, Adamore Summer League. Then you'd just see him play pickup somewhere where you'd see how hard he worked to change his game. He's just doing it with ease now, whether it was his jump shot, whether it was his handle, whether it was his jump shot or his vertical. And this quote really shows that what he was working on was actually working. He was making all of this progress in such a short period of time. And all of these different leagues, they played a very different role in his development. In some, he was able to just work on a crossover. He was able to work on his shooting. If you're playing at the highest level all the time, you don't really get to work on those things. You don't get to work on stuff in a game setting because you're trying to win, you're trying to compete. And he also didn't necessarily care about winning all the time, which I think is kind of important. When it comes to experimentation, it wasn't that he was necessarily working on a bunch of things at the same time. Kobe would experiment fairly linearly, really work on something, and then feel like he's added it to his game. He wasn't working on multiple things. He was working on one thing at a time. So an example of that is there's a good example of Dwayne Wade. He's talking about how he was watching Kobe warm up for the game. And he essentially was taking like a little post up, turnaround shot inside the arc, and he just did it over and over again. Dwayne Wade's like, I know it's coming, but I couldn't stop it the whole game. He just repeatedly hit it on me. And it reminds me of a Bruce Lee quote where he said, I'd rather fight someone who's done 1,000 kicks one time than one kick 1,000 times. That's what Kobe's philosophy was. But at the same time, if Kobe's done 1,000 kicks 1,000 times, that's a pretty overwhelming thing to get past. And he could do that. He had the time. He was willing to put in the effort to do that. This is a really interesting perspective that Kobe has here. As an adult, Kobe would explain away his behavior by saying that once he turned 13, he started playing the longer game. Because my game wasn't about being better than you at 13. It was about being better than you when the chips were really on the line. Playing at 13, I would size you up and see what your strengths and weaknesses are. How do you approach the game? Are you silly about it? Are you goofy about it? Are you good at it because you're bigger and stronger than everyone else? Or is there actually thought and skill that you put into it? So Kobe here is not just caring about winning at this age. He's caring about developing his skills for the long run, which I think is unbelievably rare for anyone. Kobe, when he was 13, he was kind of awkward. He was goofy. He hadn't grown into his body yet. He went a whole summer, which we'll talk about, without scoring a single point. He wasn't necessarily good at basketball compared to the people he was playing against. What he did know is that he could be good at these people once timing matched up, once his body matched up, and he was building those skills to be great when it mattered. For example, when he was 17, 18 years old, declaring for the NBA draft. While everyone else was trying to get scholarships, Kobe was working on a crossover. He was still treating AAU ball like every court was his own driveway. Deaf to his coach's instructions, blind to the other players, focused solely on his skills, his development, improvement, himself. A lot of people might view this as selfish. A lot of people might view this as being a bad team player. And in some sense it was, but Kobe was viewing all of these games that had lower stakes as time for him to work on his game in a real game setting. And as much as we can do that, hopefully without detrimenting our teammates, the better we can get over time. He was a master of this. And I think he got a little bit of this from his dad as well. It wasn't just that he would experiment. He also didn't have a fear of failing when he would experiment. But he created an ecosystem for him to do that really effectively. So here's Kobe on that. If I wanted to implement something new into my game, I'd see it and try incorporating it immediately. I wasn't scared of missing, looking bad, or being embarrassed. That's because I always kept the end result, the long game, in mind. I always focused on the fact that I had to try something to get it, and once I got it, I'd have another tool in my arsenal. If the price was a lot of work and a few missed shots, I was okay with that. So Kobe right here is admitting that I'm going to fail. I know that if I'm going to try something new, it's not going to look good, all this stuff. But the cost of not learning that and the benefit of having this new tool in his arsenal was worth embarrassing himself or doing any of these types of things. He was totally okay with that trade-off. And I think that that's something at least I struggled with. You don't want to attempt something new. You don't want to hit a new shot. You don't want to try a new movement pattern because you're scared you'll be bad at it. But inevitably, you're going to be bad at it if it's completely new to you. And the only way you're going to get good at it is if you go through that failure zone. Kobe would work out, test out his new moves on Anthony, explaining that Bryant would always try his most hot dog creations at the JCC gym before daring to trot them out on Philly's playgrounds. In that regard, Bannister, who was Anthony, became something of a basketball lab rat for Bryant. So Kobe created this ecosystem where, in this JCC gym with one of his friends, he would try out all this stuff. Then he would take it to the playground. Then he would take it to high school ball. Then he would take it to AAU ball. Then he would take it to the camps. And so there was this clear progression of, if I can execute this at this level, I can get to the next level. If I can execute this at this level. And while he's okay with failure, while he knows he's not going to fail sometimes, he created this sort of pipeline to be able to test and minimize failure, mitigate the risk of trying these new things, which I think is very well thought out for anyone, especially a 13, 14, 15-year-old. Here's a great quote by one of his high school teammates. So that's what greatness is about, experimenting. If we all did everything the same way and came to the same exact answer the same exact way, then there's no greatness. What makes greatness is everyone doing it this way, and I come and show people, look, you don't have to do it that way. Now there's trial and error with everything. There's trial and error in order for you to perfect it, but to reach greatness. You have to do these things. You can't take anything at face value. You have to be able to manipulate things. You have to be able to change things, or else all we'll ever be is robots. So again, this is such a good overview of how Kobe is he was great because he would try things, he would challenge convention. No one would ever tell you to just work on your crossover, just work on passing in a game. But he was willing to do that for his own personal development. And I think that really comes from more of a long-term view of performance and learning. He set these learning objectives. He's like, I'm going to learn this so I can be a complete player when I go play in the NBA. It was one thing to be okay with failure, but he was also completely self-aware of his failures, which I think is something that not a lot of us are. A lot of us, we try to shy away from what we don't think we're good at. And Kobe would actively seek out his areas of weakness and try to improve upon them. An example would be in high school, there was a documentary, film team coming in to follow around, quote unquote, the most famous high schooler in America. And he wanted to go take a public speaking class from his favorite teacher, Miss Mastriano. And it was one that he knew that he needed to get more public speaking and media savvy with a documentary film coming in. But he also kind of knew he was going to the NBA draft and he would become a very public person in the short term. And he wanted to accrue those skills as quickly as possible. Another example comes from, when he first entered the league, he got injured dunking a basketball, and he worked with his coaches to, he realized that was a flaw. His coaches told him that the way he was approaching the rim as aggressively, he was not as effective as he could be, and he was likely going to hurt himself. So he changed his dunking form, made more actual contact with the defender, and was able to pick up more fouls and also reduce his risk of injury. So he's seeing that these things are coming to him. This quote really stuck to me. He also rang up 3 equally quick turnovers, including a play in which he stepped out of bounds in his eagerness to get to the basket and dunk. When I caught the ball in the corner, he admitted, at first I said, I'm going to shoot it. All right. I'm going to stroke it. But then I saw the big old lane under the hoop, and I started licking my chops. I said, oh man, I'm going to finish this. But I was overexcited. My back step was a little too long. That was just being over anxious, getting to the hoop. I'm like, man, if I can just get to that block, I can get this dunk. I'm there, I'm home, I'm free. That was a little over anxious right there. So he's talking to the media, and he is transparent about his shortcomings. He realized he was over anxious. He realized that he made a mistake, and he was very comfortable with admitting that. In that same documentary that I described before, Kobe Doing Work, he's going over all of the plays that he did, and he'll be like, yeah, I was out of position. That was a bad play. I need to do better. He's painfully aware of the flaws in his game. And the more we pay attention to that, maybe it's not great for our self-esteem, but that's something we can build on and work on. And in a lot of sports, you do have to defend your weaknesses. There are some where you can only focus on your strengths, but I would argue overall, it pays to at least know where you're deficient and really focus on that. One final example with the practice, the reps and the experimentation is that he found ways to practice and get these reps in that were maybe a little bit out there. So something he would do, he would play shadow basketball, especially when he was a kid. So growing up in Italy, he didn't always have people to play basketball with him. Soccer was a lot more popular in Italy. And so he, a lot of the time, had to play basketball by himself. He played against an imaginary opponent. He was watching all these videos of the greatest basketball players of all time. So he could play mock one-on-one, play mock situations with these great players, knowing their moves, knowing how they approach things. And in the league, he would go through a lot of walkthroughs, do a lot of practice without a ball at all, which I think Lamar Odom thought was really weird. I got to train with a jiu-jitsu world champion a couple months ago. And I talked to him after, and he told me something he did is that every night he visualizes all the movements he's working on. He's able to go through these things in his mind. And there's good research that suggests that the neural pathways for any movements that you visualize have real world impact. So there's a famous study where if you visualize bench pressing, you actually increase your bench press significantly compared to people that did not visualize it and did not exercise. But that's a very unique way, especially for jiu-jitsu or even basketball, where there's a lot of wear and tear on your body, to get reps in without having to go through the negative physical consequences of these types of things. So if you think about all the training and practice that Kobe did, even just in his mind, that goes well beyond those 20 hours that I projected out earlier. It really reduces strain, it reduces and increases the ability for anyone to visualize. So for me, I'm always thinking about how can I get more reps? How can I get these things in? What can you do to get reps in an unconventional way without necessarily having to sacrifice your body or use that time, just being creative with the time that you have. Something that I do, I have, like, for example, a golf putting mat. When I have a little extra time between when I'm recording or working, I can go hit putts. Maybe that'll make me a little bit better over the long term. I would hope so. But, little things like that. What can we do to work on those skills? The next section is focused on goals and understanding weaknesses. So Kobe, like many great athletes, knew what he wanted at a very young age. So as early as 8th grade, he told one of his friends, Matt Cobb, who he was really close with, that his plan was to play in the NBA. It wasn't a goal, it was his plan, and there was something meticulous about it. As he grew older, his goals developed. So when he entered the league, he had all these things in mind, that he wanted to be an all-star, that he wanted to be a starter, and that he wanted to average 20 points a game. All these things that eventually happened for him, he saw them. He wanted to come in and do those things, but he didn't want to come in talking about them. He has a certain confidence that other people don't have and can't carry. So, something you notice about those goals is they're very specific. They're what people would consider SMART goals. So specific, measurable, attainable, something with an R, and then time bound. I have to review that. But goals are, for him, were very clear what he wanted to learn, what he wanted to improve upon. But something that I found really interesting is that in a book that I read called The Genius of Athletes, is that goals that are long-term aren't necessarily best if they have all those characteristics of SMART goals that I described. So if you have a very vague long-term goal, for example, Kobe was to be one of the greatest basketball players of all time, if not the greatest basketball player of all time. That's a lot less intimidating and overwhelming than saying that he wanted to win 6 or 7 NBA championships. Because the more specific you make it the further out, the more overwhelming it feels in the present. The more vague and the more amorphous you make it further out, the better. The closer to the present that you are, the more specific you want to make it. So an example of this would be where Kobe's saying, I added a lot of dimensions to my game. My mindset coming into the season was to try to be a better rebounder and be better defensively. Try to cause some havoc on the defensive side. Obviously, I didn't know I was going to be a starter. So that gives me more chances to get rebounds. So when the seasons comes, he's working on these very specific things. Over the course of his career, he's working on these broader amorphous things. One of his goals, which I think is a very interesting goal, for me, how professional athletes set goals is fascinating. Kobe wanted to do everything when he was young. So he wanted to be great at basketball, be in the NBA. He wanted to get married while he was young. He wanted to have children while he was young. He didn't want to wait for anything. And, those are things that he had total control over outside of getting into the NBA. But it's interesting to see the urgency that he has associated with these goals. Something that I learned later, and when you hear him talking about these podcasts and these types of things, he tells everyone that his goal was to get 8 rings. But I don't think I started hearing that from him until after he was retired, until he'd already had a couple rings. I don't think his goal was to get 8 rings when he first entered the league. I think that evolved over time. And that's sort of how, very similar to setting the amorphous goals further out, that goal became more and more refined over time. I don't know for sure if that's exactly how it played out for him, but that's what my speculation is. Unfortunately, I can't ask him about that. Here's another pretty good quote. At the end of my first season in the NBA, we'd made it to the semifinals up against Utah. But in the deciding 5th game, I let fly 4 air balls, and we lost our chance at the title. These shots let me know more about what I needed to work on most, my strength. That's all those air balls did for me. So he's taking this failure, this weakness that he had where he's shooting these air balls, and making it diagnosable. He's not dwelling on it. He's figuring out what's actionable about that. To me, that is a very powerful skill, something that we can learn from. You later hear about how he's taking, that experience as a benefit. Yeah. Again, another quote here is that I think that's what people like Michael and Kobe love about Tex. So Tex Winter is the coach at Chicago. Was a coach for Michael in Chicago, assistant coach for Kobe. They welcome coaching. They welcome honest criticism. And it's funny to contrast that to Shaq, where he's not easy to coach. He has kind of resentment for anyone to tell him anything that he's doing wrong. So that's maybe a little bit about why they didn't get along, is that Kobe was very open to criticism. He loved criticism. He loved to want to improve. But other people might not view that in the same way. So, I want to end this section talking about goals. So how do you set your goals? What are your goals? Can we get better at setting our goals? A good framework that I found, it's from this book called The 4 Disciplines of Execution. You essentially set one wildly important goal, sort of that vaguer goal for the long term. And then you have process goals. So things that you have complete control over. So the best example is, let's say my wildly important goal for this podcast is for it to be over time, the most comprehensive long-term study of greatness in sports, right? I can't just go out and do that. I have to set process goals in order to make that happen. So a process goal that I have complete control over is I can study a new athlete and release a series of episodes every month. That's something I have complete control over. I can try to interview 4 or 5 people or read a certain number of books every month. After that, a really important thing is having a scoreboard. So keeping track of those process goals, making sure I'm hitting them every month. And then the last thing is getting feedback and accountability from other people. And having someone to hold me specifically accountable to that. I think those are the foundation of effective goals in one framework that I've been a part of. The next section is called Imitation is Flattery. I think this is probably my favorite section of this episode because so many people have compared Kobe to Michael Jordan. They're saying he's copying his style, that he's replicating what other people have done. And my thought is, yeah, obviously, why would you not want to imitate or replicate what the best people ever have done? That seems completely normal. That seems like how you get to become one of the best. You take what other people have done and you make it your own. I mean, even as a kid, when he came to the States, he's watching all this Laker basketball. He showed up with knee pads and goggles like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. It's even these little things that you copy. Why wouldn't you want to, especially as a kid, emulate what greatness is? Kobe, as a kid in high school, he had this video section just of Michael Jordan, where he'd watch these tapes and then he'd replicate the moves. This is completely, again, normal behavior to become great like this. He would also, related to Michael Jordan, who's probably the person he emulated most. I mean, they were similar in size. He was 6'6". They similar athleticism. Why wouldn't you want to replicate someone who was around your size? He also, when he was a kid, his dad was 6'9". He was bigger than Kobe is. He wanted to replicate how Magic Johnson played. But Magic Johnson, Kobe didn't end up being that size. It didn't make sense for him to try to play the same style of game. So this is a really cool aspect of what Michael has to say about Kobe, quote unquote, copying him. During the league's pre-draft camp in Orlando late that May, Jordan sat and talked quietly about how hard Bryant had worked to be great. He and Bryant were obviously close, and Jordan spoke up to defend Bryant against critics that claimed he was merely copying Jordan. Jordan said that he didn't see what all the big fuss was about. After all, human behavior was mimetic. That's how humans learned. They copied and aped each other. Jordan acknowledged that Bryant was the best of a generation of players who had sought to be like Mike. But how many people lighted the path for me, Jordan asked. That's the evolution of basketball. There's no way I could have played the way I played if I didn't watch David Thompson and the guys prior to me. There's no way Kobe would have played the way he's played without watching me play. So, that's the evolution of basketball. You cannot change that. There's, again, no problem with copying the people you admired. Maybe don't plagiarize work at school, but you can definitely copy an action, a movement. I mean, the whole focus of, again, this podcast is for me to study these great people and take everything that I can. They put this out there for us to take. Kobe also, and as he grew up in the league and became an older statesman and these types of things, he was more than happy to share knowledge with younger players, with players that he felt like really were trying to improve and get better and were willing to ask him for his advice. And again, this isn't just Michael Jordan that Kobe's copying and following. He would read up on Scottie Pippen when he tried to improve his defensive techniques. And again, still on Magic Johnson, still on all of the greatest players of all time. And even he would take things from, for example, hockey, right? He would watch Wayne Gretzky and try to, he had a great conversation with, I think it was the team manager in high school where he asked him the kid said he was really into hockey. And Kobe's like, yeah, I love hockey. I love Wayne Gretzky. I've studied him. So, and it's not just in playing. So Kobe is trying to absorb everything that he can about these players and replicate those things. This is a perfect example of that. All the tapes had one thing in common. Each of them was one of the 4 Game 7s that Magic Johnson had played in his career. Jordan would only play 2 in his. This time, he wasn't focusing on Magic's no-look passes and slope shoulder dribble as he led the fast break. His precognition of where all his teammates would be on the court and when they would be there. This time, Kobe focused on something else. How did he handle the pressure? Did he let the game come to him? Did he go out and take it? Or did he lead his team to victory? Then Kobe focused on himself. What if his shots didn't fall? What if his teammates' shots didn't fall? How would they withstand the crowd noise at the Palestra? How would they react if and when Chester took the lead? How would they handle the adversity? I was very nervous, he said later. At the same time, I was excited because I knew it was a chance of a lifetime. I knew that we could beat them, that there wasn't any doubt that we could beat them. We just had to play our game. There's a lot in that passage that I really liked. I mean, again, Kobe is trying to learn first about how Magic Johnson responded in this like key pressure situation. So this is probably the most intense game of Kobe's high school career, the state championship where I think Marion hadn't won in a really long time, if ever. Lower Marion hadn't won in that period of time. And so he's not only studying Magic for this, but he's also looking internally about how to create a game plan for himself. So there's something called if-then planning, which is a really popular sort of sports psychology approach that I got from that Genius of Athletes book. And essentially, you can scenario. So if you have a reaction for pretty much any planning session or anytime something goes wrong, you can just execute rather than think. And thinking while playing sports generally is not a good thing. You want to be able to just execute and have some programming to be able to do that. It's also interesting to hear how he's talking about how he was nervous, but he was excited at the same time. That's another thing that we use. It's called reframing. So the physiological response of nervousness as well as excitement are the same. Your body goes to the same actions. Like you sweat a little bit, your heart rate elevates, those types of things. And so it's up to us to tell what emotion we have. We can tell ourselves that I'm excited rather than nervous, that I'm elevated rather than anxious. And then in a broader scheme of things, as we end the imitation section, I would like us all to think about who we would like to imitate. I mean, we see imitation not just in sports, but in industry as well. So I don't know if many people know this, but Steve Jobs, someone that he took massive inspiration from was Edwin Land, who was the founder or like the creator of the Polaroid. So as you can imagine, we all have little phones with cameras, very powerful cameras in our pockets now. That's direct inspiration from the vision that Edwin Land had that everyone could walk around with a like really good camera in their pocket all the time. Elon Musk took massive inspiration from Henry Ford. And even this podcast, I get a ton of inspiration from the Founders Podcast. I mean, it's a little bit different. I'm focusing on athletes. It's a little bit more long form. But to me, there's a tremendous amount of beauty, and I would think it's pretty smart to just take after the people and who are coming before you. This next section is focused on asking questions. So it wasn't just that Kobe would imitate these people. He would go and ruthlessly ask questions to anyone who he thought could help him out or had answers. And he was completely unafraid to ask questions of everyone great. So, here's a quote that exemplifies that. Just as important as reading was cultivating relationships with the greats who'd come before me. Those guys taught me the lessons that gave me an edge over my competition. So he's viewing these conversations, being able to ask these questions as a way for him to get ahead. And it absolutely was. This is maybe the best quote from him. I love this one. I asked a ton of questions. I was curious. I wanted to improve, to learn, to fill my head with history of the game. No matter who I was with, a coach, a Hall of Famer, a teammate, and no matter the situation, a game, a practice, a vacation, I would fire away with question after question. A lot of people appreciated my curiosity and passion. My approach was always that I'd rather risk embarrassment now than be embarrassed later when I've won 0 titles. That one of any of the quotes gives me chills. Kobe is thinking about in the long run. He says, I can have this a little bit of embarrassment. I can not ask this question now and it might save some social awkwardness, but I lose out on the long-term benefit of a lot of these things. And that's how he viewed almost everything. I think him asking questions is like a microcosm or a macrocosm of that. In particular, he also really asked Jordan a lot of questions. They developed a really good relationship where they text back and forth, where he'd send Jordan a text at 3 a.m. asking about something and Jordan would get him right back. During a pause in play in the fourth period, Jordan was stunned to find Bryant brazenly asking advice on posting up. In the fourth quarter of the game, he asked me about my post-up move in terms of, do you keep your legs wide or do you keep your legs tight? It was kind of shocking, Jordan said later. I felt like an old guy when he asked me that. So this is the first time Kobe played Jordan. And during the game, he's asking these questions. The questions could not wait for Kobe. And I think that that's important to realize, is that you might not ever get another time to ask the person in front of you a question. You should really be, cavalier with asking the questions, as long as it's not too out of the blue, not too rude. There's only one person that can give you this knowledge that they have. They probably like to share it because they've worked hard to accumulate it. But again, you might not get another chance. Or if you're in Kobe's shoes, you might want to integrate that as soon as possible. You might get compounding returns the sooner you ask these questions. Sort of a continuation of that quote is when Jordan's talking about how to develop those skills. He says, that's tough, that's experience. That's things that Larry Bird and Magic Johnson all taught me. There's no doubt that he has the skills to take over the basketball game. And, you're just seeing that Michael Jordan was doing these same things. You're seeing the legacy get passed down and passed down. A lot of people don't get the legacy passed down because they don't ask the questions. And here's sort of Kobe paying it forward. So Bryant told a reporter that getting advice from Jordan is like getting advice from the Buddha that sits on the top of a mountain, who has everything figured out and passes on some of his knowledge to the next guy who's trying to climb that mountain. And then Kobe says here, what you get from me is from him. I don't get 5 championships here without him. And so again, Kobe is saying, of course, I'm asking these questions and I'm appreciating this knowledge. I'm going to recognize these people. You have to do something in return. The best thing you can do for any of the people you ask questions from, who you get information from, is to have incredible performance and give them credit, right? And again, it wasn't just players that Kobe was getting this information from. It was from coaches. It was from anyone who's been around greatness. He particularly gravitated towards Tex Winter, who again was an assistant coach for the Bulls during their championship runs with Jordan, and was the assistant coach for the Lakers with Phil Jackson for Kobe's 5, or I think it was most of his 5 championship rings. And Tex Winter is probably most popularized for the triangle offense being his brainchild. So as the season wound to a close, Kobe expressed to a writer that he dreamed about playing for Tex Winter, the elderly Bulls assistant who had pioneered the triangle offense. Bryant had become infatuated with the system that had helped Jordan win 6 championships. The writer offered to set them up with a conversation, and he also offered to set him up with a conversation with Jordan. They soon connected through long distance. It was Bryant's first contact with the man who would become his mentor and defender. Bryant was likewise interested in a conversation with Jordan to seek more advice. When the writer provided Jordan's number, he asked, what would you ask Michael? And then Kobe goes, I'd ask him about how to incorporate math into the game. As like a data person, I really enjoyed that answer. I still have absolutely no clue what it means. Maybe someone who I interview, I will try to get them to tell me a little bit more about that. If I interview an NBA player or something along those lines, which I plan to do for this series. So Tex, who was probably 80 or something at the time, was out there not just pointing out, but literally with ball in hand demonstrating it. He'd show Kobe something and Kobe would mimic it. Tex was coaching at the time, maybe the best player in the world of what most people would consider rudimentary skill work. But Kobe ate that stuff up, loved it. Kobe was an indefatigable worker and just a passion for practice on the court. You talk about some of the common things with Michael and Kobe. They both love practice, they both love work, and they loved practice, and they love to drill. Kobe obviously had this gravitation towards Tex Winter because, one, he was around greatness, he created greatness as a coach, and he was there to learn everything, whether it was the fundamentals, the footwork, they were there to do it together. Something that a lot of people don't realize is that Kobe was in pursuit of all this knowledge. It wasn't just about playing, it was about leadership as well. Kobe was not known for being a great leader over the course of his career. And I think that that's just because he hadn't figured it out yet. He hadn't been in a position where he had to lead other NBA players that were of equal talent, maybe not of as equal skill. And that took a lot of time for him to adjust. But he was constantly in pursuit of understanding how to lead. So here's an example. The Lakers brought a longtime veteran, Byron Scott, back to the team to be a mentor. Scott took to Bryant because the rookie was different from so many young players passing through the league. Bryant was familiar with basketball history and wanted to soak up everything he could about Scott's days with Johnson and the Showtime Lakers. He also pushed for information and advice on training and pacing himself to be successful in the game. So he just wants to understand what the Showtime Lakers were like. He wants to understand how the management was, how Magic was, how all these people integrated together. Here's another one where he's talking with Schaefer, who was performance coach for Michael Jordan. We certainly had our conversations about Michael, and he would ask me specific questions about how he would handle situations. Kobe was often curious about how, not just basketball specific stuff, but even some of the peripheral things, like if a team was going through something, how would Michael react towards a teammate? He was interested in what kind of leadership and management Michael would have. So again, that focuses on that leadership point. What can you learn about the overall team, about these individual people, not just as players, but as leaders and teammates? A fun example is that essentially if you're close to greatness or if you've witnessed it, Kobe is interested in talking to you. So there was a Notre Dame assistant coach who watched him play in high school. Kobe's on the ride home and someone asked if they knew who he was. And he goes, yeah, I was a Notre Dame assistant coach. And the person in the car with him says, no, yes, he is the Notre Dame assistant coach, but he played at UNC with Michael Jordan. And Kobe goes, oh my goodness, like, is he still around? Let me talk to him. I want to learn all this stuff. And, it's a little transactional, but Kobe was in pursuit. If he thought you could provide something interesting to him, something that would build his knowledge base, you were unbelievably interesting to him. He obviously had a lot of relationships with other greats, Jerry West, Magic Johnson, Bill Russell, even his dad, that he was constantly asking questions of and in contact with. Even in this book, The Mamba Mentality, he has 20 pages of notes on all the great players he played with and played against and what he learned from them and how he tried to defend them and how he approached them. And again, this isn't anything novel to Kobe. I mean, A-Rod was doing this with Cal Ripken. All these great entrepreneurs, like I talked about, were going and doing this and asking people that came before them. Kobe actually even took this to his post-NBA work, where he called up Oprah, he called up Tim Cook, he called up all these incredible entrepreneurs and said, hey, how do you do this? Let me ask you all these questions. And he was sending them questions at 3 a.m. But they all saw the same obsession, the same passion in themselves that he had. And a lot of them were very responsive to how he would approach things and to his questions. For me, I'm thinking about constantly, who should I reach out to? Who should I talk to? Even though it's sort of intimidating, how do I talk to people in the space that could help provide insight around Kobe, could provide insight around any of the topics we have at hand? And I would behoove you to do that as well. Who do you think could dramatically help your career? How would you reach out to them? How can you show them that you're as passionate and intense about what they're doing as you are? So this next section is called Finding the Whole. This is probably the most unique section about how Kobe approaches learning. And it's because he looks for things that aren't necessarily there. That to me is really interesting. So he is looking for the gap in what is there, not necessarily just what is there on face value. Here's a quote that sort of exemplifies that. So I went from watching what was there to watching for what was missing and what should have been there. I went from watching what happened and what could have and should have happened. Film study eventually became imagining alternatives, counters, options, in addition to finite details of why some actions work and others don't work. So his attention to detail was so great that he was looking to see the entire picture, and then he was looking outside the picture to evaluate what should have been there, what was missing. To me, that is a very, very high level of understanding and nuance about the learning process. Something that he paid particular attention to was his footwork. And I think the footwork is a really good metaphor for how we view compounding and progress. So there's all this stuff on the footwork, Schaefer called with a laugh: inside reverse pivot, outside reverse pivot, the front turn, the rear turn, whatever. Kobe was fascinated by footwork. A lot of people that are good, that are a good athlete, don't need that because they can get by somebody just out of pure athleticism. But I think Kobe realized, okay, if I'm quicker than my opponent and I have better footwork than my opponent, I'm really going to have something. So you get this advantage of being athletic and having good technique. And those two things compound and make you dramatically faster. So for a guy that is average athletic and has bad footwork, Kobe is going to run circles around them all the time. And he's still going to run circles around people that just are athletic, because they're probably not going to be that much more athletic with him. It began with his immaculate footwork, an array of pivots, reverse pivots, jab steps, and feints that allowed him to create room to rise up in a tight space, often pinned in against the sideline to elevate over the defender and to make seemingly impossible shots under impossible circumstances. This unique skill was a perfectly performed product of his study of untold hours of videotape of every single one of the game's great scorers. It also involved conversations and more film study with Tex Winter about footwork and time spent with Jerry West talking about a million important details, such as the angle of his elbow in relation to his forehead for the perfect shot. There's so much focus on this single part of the game. There's so much detail that goes into this one thing. If he's putting this much effort into just his footwork, into just, creating space, how much better is he going to be than everyone else when they're just looking at it as something that they do, that's something that comes natural to them? I think that if we break down all of our movements, we break down any segment of how we approach a game, we get a massive benefit. Another example of this is his pump fake. So there's countless people, I think it was Drew Holiday and a few others, talking about how good Kobe's pump fake was, how they knew it was coming and they'd still essentially jump the block and he'd just go around them. That's because he practiced it so much. And he practiced it so much, he got really good at defending against people who would pump fake. He recognized that essentially when people would pump fake, they would drop their right foot. And that's something that he always looked for, because he knew if they dropped the right foot, they couldn't shoot from that position. It was a very interesting approach. And, he says it after he's been playing against these people for a while. And this bleeds into his conditioning as well. So he focused all of his cardio workouts around recovery. So he knew the pace of a game, you're sprinting a lot, you're resting a lot, you're sprinting a lot, and you're resting a lot. And so he would build his specific practice routine, matching the game time. He would also, everyone talks about this, how late he would practice and all these things. He's practicing when the games were. So he's actually acclimating himself a little bit better than quite a lot of people to the lifestyle of an NBA player. So I want to focus a little bit more on what's missing. There's a couple good examples of that where he's doing this imagination and scenario planning. The first one is here. So reading is fundamental. I made a point of reading the referee's handbook. One of the rules I gleaned from it was that each referee has a designated slot where he's supposed to be on the floor. When they do that, it's created dead zones, areas on the floor where they can't see certain things. I learned where those zones were, and I took advantage of them. I would get away with holds, travels, and all sorts of minor violations simply because I took the time to understand the officials' limitations. So Kobe is going through, he's learning the ref's tendencies, and he's leveraging that into an advantage. To me, that is the epitome of looking for what's missing. He's willing to go read the ref's handbook. I don't know. I would bet 5 NBA players maybe ever have read the ref's handbook. And then he's being able to apply this knowledge to give him an advantage. He saw the refs as a place to get advantage a lot of the time. So, for example, Kobe would have really good relationships with the refs. He also knew the rules cold. And so, why would you want to argue with Kobe when you know he's probably going to be right more often than not, when he's going to hold you accountable, when he's going to do all these things? So there's so many players that complain about how Kobe got all the calls, Kobe did all this, but it's because he knew the refs, he knew the system that they were operating in better than anyone else. How would you not get all the calls? Another area where he did this is he knew all the players he was going up against. He knew all the rookies who were going to be defending him or who he's going to be playing against. And the rookies would be like, oh my goodness, Kobe knows my name. Kobe knows who I am. And that was just him softening them up so he could dominate them, basically. Another area of this is that he would look in other people's careers and see what was missing. So in his dad's career, in the NBA, his dad was never the man. His dad never had a team. His dad never was like the guy in the league. And that's something he integrated into his life, into all his AAU, into all his lead up, is he wanted to be the man on every single team. This also, some of my favorite stuff is the trash talk stories that he has. These types of things, the looking for detail, it also comes into trash talking. So an example of that is he has a game coming up again in high school against this guy, Donnie Carr. And he finds out that this guy, Arthur Davis, who was on the team with Donnie Carr, probably wouldn't be playing. So he calls up Donnie Carr the night before, and he basically says, now let me see if I can find it. Wanted to see if it was just going to be you at the game, because if it's just you, I don't even know if it's worth me coming. So he's just like talking trash in high school. He does something similar to Ray Allen. He finds out that it worked. He's speaking Spanish and Italian and these different languages on the court. All of this, like, yes, it's good for team bonding, for camaraderie, but it's to confuse his opponents. These little things, they all add up and they make it confusing for other players. They disorient the other players. I mean, it's different from the norm of what they're playing. The last thing under the umbrella of finding the hole is challenging conventional wisdom. So Kobe was known for doing this since he was in high school. So in class, among his peers, he didn't talk much, though in Mastriano's memory, he was the type of student who would not have hesitated to say, and not in terribly antagonistic tones, "Why are we learning this? I don't see where this is going. It's not doing anything for me." He wasn't afraid to speak out. He wasn't afraid to humbly question what was going on. And if he got a good answer, he would move forward. A good example of this is his orthokine surgery. So he went to Germany to get work done on his knees. This is an experimental treatment. It wasn't approved in the US, but he balanced the risk and reward. He talked to enough people. He found that this was a worthwhile thing for him to do to ease the pain and to give him more longevity in his career. It ended up, he recommended this to A-Rod. A-Rod had a good experience with this as well, and it worked out well for both of them. That's part, of the connection between athletes and talking and getting information, but it's also some risk tolerance and being willing to challenge convention. My favorite way that he challenged convention was with his shoes. So in 2008, I decided I wanted my next signature sneaker to be a low top. When I told Nike that, at first they said no. I responded, "You can't say no. I got the idea from watching football." So soccer. Those guys put even more torque on their ankles and lower legs than basketball players. And they were wearing boots cut even lower than our sneakers. The fallacy of a high top was that players believed it protected your ankles. Actually, it weakens them and saps mobility. So Kobe is looking at other sports. He's looking at all these other domains and questioning the conventional wisdom of basketball. He questioned conventional wisdom about healing, recovery, how to play, all of these types of things. And in the long run, all of these questions paid off for him. Now, if we're thinking about, how we approach any sport, what could we dive deep into? Is it technique? Is it our mentality? Is it our philosophy? What can we get more detail oriented in? What can we start looking for the holes or what's missing in? To me, that's a really good question that I need to ponder a little bit more. The last section in this in part one of this series is focused on love of the game. So again, so many people talk about the hard work Kobe is putting in, but is it really willpower? Is it really discipline if you love what you do? So I think that love for the game is something that really drove a lot of Kobe's work ethic. And it's something that we're going to talk a lot more about in part two, but there is a little bit of stuff here that I think I wanted to call out as it relates to learning. So I read that quote earlier where Tex Winter is coaching Kobe on the basic fundamental movements, and him and Michael Jordan were happily complying and working on these things. It's because they love the game, they love the practice, and they love to drill. Again, I'm going to go in the next section, talk a little bit about where that love comes from, but the love of the craft, the love of the process is something that I think is unbelievably valuable for being willing to spend the time that you need to pick up and acquire skills. This is a great story where, when Kobe was entering the league, he ended up hurting his wrist. So the first thing I heard about Kobe was that he had injured his wrist playing at Venice. I just couldn't believe that a guy would be playing pickup in Venice Beach. That was my first experience with how excited and enthusiastic he was just about playing the game. He truly had a passion for playing, regardless of where it was, what time of day he was going to play. And it's funny, the other great basketball players, they get this. So Jerry West knew about this, and he didn't seem worried. This guy will play a little league tournament, he said. It doesn't bother me. He loves to play basketball. He's one of the more dedicated players I've ever seen. How much do you love your sport? What could you do to make you love your own sport more? What could you do to love your own profession or any of the things you're involved in more? all of this stuff should be a pursuit of love. And that's something that gives us a tremendous amount of energy. Again, in part 2, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into what creates love, creates motivation for Kobe Bryant in particular. A lot of this really does come from intrinsic motivation, or pushing yourself forward rather than extrinsic reward. And figuring out how to sort of program yourself for those intrinsic motivations is really important. As we end here, I want to make sure we just go through and touch on all the topics we covered. So just as a reminder, we touched on Kobe's immense curiosity, how he was able to build things that were more than basketball, outside of basketball, and fold them into his game. So he was able to take these parallels and skills that he developed in other areas and integrate it into basketball. He also had a unique way of integrating experimentation into the thousands and thousands, maybe even millions of reps that he took on the basketball court. He was excellent at setting goals as an NBA player and as a high schooler, and his goals varied, from long-term goals to short-term goals that got more concrete. He was willing to copy other players that he admired. He really got deep in the weeds in copying Magic Johnson, in particular Michael Jordan, and that he was ruthless in asking questions to anyone that could provide him information. He also was really good and detail-oriented at finding the whole, looking for what was missing from an equation, not just looking at the details there. And then finally, he absolutely loved the game. He found ways to love the game, and that is something that lit a fire under his ability to learn. Again, thank you for listening to this. Part 2 is about the philosophy and mindset that Kobe Bryant had. If you want to support this podcast, if you enjoyed it, the best possible thing you could do is share it. Also, write a review on whatever platform you're listening to. Again, I really appreciate you coming in. I've left a link to all of the books I've read, all the podcasts I listened to, all the YouTube videos that I watched on Kobe in the show notes or in the description below. So I really appreciate you taking this amount of time to tune in with me, and I hope you enjoy the next section as well.